Hey there, I'm Carrie, and in this video I'm going to be talking about The Oval Portrait, a very short story by Edgar Allan Poe published in 1842. I'm going to do a summary first and then go back and do an analysis, talk about themes, symbolism, and other stuff that you might see on a test or in an essay question. I've got timestamps in the video notes, so definitely scroll down, click around, find exactly what it is you need. Also, this video is by request, so thank you very much to the person who suggested the story. And without further ado, let's get into The Oval Portrait. Our story is told by an unnamed narrator, and we really don't get much information on him at all, except that he seems to be a wealthy or aristocratic person because he travels with a valet, a personal servant who is named Pedro. Also, he seems to have been seriously injured in some way. We don't know how. He also seems to be far from home because night is coming on and they do not have any place to stay. They come upon a chateau, which is like a big castle home up there in the mountains, and Pedro actually forces his way in. They break into this chateau, which looks like it's empty. It seems like someone has just up and left. And they decide to stay the night in there so that he will not have to sleep out in the open when he's in this injured condition. Now, the chateau, this castle type house, is very grand. You know, it's a beautiful home and it's full of expensive antiques, but everything's kind of worn down. Everything's just kind of ratty and bedraggled. They find a room in a turret, which is like a little tower built into the castle wall where they can stay the night. They go in there and the place is crammed full of paintings, like nice paintings, really expensive looking, beautiful artwork in these gorgeous, very elaborate frames. Now, as evening comes on, the narrator is unable to sleep, so he just spends his time looking at all these paintings that are displayed all over the room. He even finds a little booklet on the pillow of the bed in there that has like the history, the background of all of these paintings. So he just spends hours staring at the paintings and reading up on them in this little booklet. As night comes on and it gets darker in the room, the narrator needs a little bit more light to read. So he takes a candle and moves it closer to the booklet. Well, moving the candle shifts all the shadows in the room, and all of a sudden light falls on a painting that the narrator has never seen before. It's been kind of tucked away, and it's a portrait of a young woman. And it's very striking. It's ultra lifelike, like weirdly so. The narrator can't take his eyes off it. He just sits there staring at this portrait until he finally comes to his senses at some point and grabs the booklet to look up the background of this particular painting. Well, the booklet gives a little story behind this painting. It talks about a very beautiful young woman who is a wonderful person. She's just full of life. She's a playful person. She's happy. She's a very loving person. And she falls in love with and marries a painter, a guy who's very talented, very well known. He's a famous painter. Well, it's not a great match. These two really should not have been together because he is already basically married to his work and it monopolizes his time. And the young woman, his wife, comes to resent his work. She hates his art because it takes him away from her. Well, the painter decides that he wants to paint his wife. He wants to paint this young woman. She's not really enthusiastic about this, but she goes with it, you know, to please her husband. And they spend weeks tucked away in this turret room during the portrait process. Well, sure enough, the artist just gets lost in his work. He gets lost in the process. You know, he's completely absorbed in this portrait. And he doesn't notice that as the weeks go by in this dark little tower room, his wife is getting sick. As the painting progresses and gets closer to completion, she is actually getting weaker and weaker. Finally, they are at the end of the process. There's just one brushstroke to be done at the eye and one to be done at the mouth. And so the painter puts the finishing touches on this portrait and he just stands back and looks at it. He's absolutely entranced. This is like a masterpiece. Last line of the story. While he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. Okay, as I mentioned, this is a really short story. It's only about 2 pages long, but there is a whole lot packed in there. So let's go back to the beginning and do some analysis. First of all, this is Gothic fiction. Edgar Allan Poe loved the Gothic genre. The first thing that you need to know about Gothic is it has a strong medieval influence. So you'll see lots of kings and queens and faraway kingdoms and knights and ladies and castles, frequently very bizarre castles, and usually there is some element of the supernatural in the story, you know, witches or ghosts, angels, demons, things like that. Now, a very popular subgenre of Gothic is vampire fiction. Dracula is a classic Gothic novel. Now, I bring that up because I think we have a vampire in this story. You know, perhaps not, you know, an actual Dracula in a cape with fangs and that kind of thing, but we do have a parasitic presence in this story, a malevolent influence in this story, and I will talk about that more as we go along. Our setting is a remote chateau, which is like a castle. It's a big, stately home that's in the Apennine Mountains in Italy. Both scenes take place in a turret, which is a little tower that would be built into the wall of a castle. The narrator says that this chateau, this house, is a pile of commingled gloom and grandeur, which is maybe the best description I have ever heard about anything. So it's a beautiful, grandiose house, but there's something dark and unsettling about it. You know, he's not excited to be there, and it's crammed with these expensive furnishings that haven't really been kept up. Everything's kind of tattered, it's bedraggled. When the narrator is describing this chateau, he said that places like this exist not less in fact than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. So this is a shout out to Anne Radcliffe. She was an English novelist born in 1764, and she was one of the first people on the scene in the Gothic genre. Very, very influential, and she loved to use these decrepit, crumbling castle homes in her stories. They were one of her favorite tools, and so the narrator is saying, like, man, this is just like something out of an Anne Radcliffe book, you know. Now, another thing about this chateau, very strange, the narrator says, to all appearance, so the way it looks, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. The place is empty. It looks like somebody up and left in a hurry. So why would they do that with this grandiose house, apparently in this beautiful location there in the Apennine Mountains, that's full of valuables? If the owners, you know, or the family that lives there, if they were just gone for the night or gone for a week or something, this place would not be totally abandoned. There would still be servants working there to keep the house up. There would be guards. They wouldn't have just been able to break into this place. There would probably be animals around, you know, horses or dogs or something like that. But it is empty. Also, you know, a wealthy family might have multiple homes, for sure. They could have, you know, this could be the summer castle. This could be a seasonal home for them. But a seasonal home, when the family left for the season, it would have been properly closed up. The windows and doors would have been well secured. Furniture would have been wrapped up. The kitchen would have been emptied out. You know, nothing that could cause damage or cause a fire or anything like that. That all would have been cleaned out of the house, and any kind of valuables would have been removed. So none of that has happened. They're able to break in pretty easily, it looks like. Pedro can do it on his own. They find a bed to sleep in. They find candles that they can light. And they found this room full of these expensive looking paintings. This is not acceptable long-term storage for valuable art. It shouldn't be left there. So again, who owns this castle and why did they leave? What is going on here? Well, I think that we should notice that, as I said, both scenes in here take place in a turret. Our narrator finds this remote turret to stay the night in, and we know that the actual portrait of this young woman was done in a dark, shadowy turret. So maybe we can consider that this is the room that the portrait was actually completed in. Perhaps this turret where the narrator is staying is the artist's studio. That might explain why all the paintings are gathered in one place if this is where the artist works, but it doesn't explain why that little booklet is there. Why would the artist need a booklet describing all of the paintings in detail? It kind of looks like maybe someone's gathered them there getting ready to auction them off. Maybe this is an auctioneer's booklet to describe it all to the people that might be buying. But if this is the artist's studio and this chateau belongs to this painter and belongs to, to his wife, to his family, where is he? Did somebody leave because, they're mourning what took place there? They're leaving so that they can grieve in private? Or is something else going on? Did somebody leave because they're running away from something? As I mentioned, there's a malevolent presence in this story, a parasitic presence. So maybe someone was trying to get away from it. Okay, let's zero in on the character, starting with the speaker. Again, unnamed narrator. We don't get a ton of information about him, except he does seem to be far from home. And far from any cities. There's no family mentioned. He is not, just a day's ride from his house or anything like that. We don't know why he's there. He and Pedro are up there in the Apennine Mountains. Is he on a rock climbing vacation? Maybe that's how he got hurt. Is he on business? Is he just passing through? Are they lost? We really don't know. Now, we do know he's injured. It seems to be serious. It could be a head injury because he references becoming delirious. However, that could also be an injury, a wound on a different part of the body that has become infected and is causing a fever, and that's making him delirious. We don't know, but he is not in a good state. We also know that he is wealthy or aristocratic. He travels with a personal servant, his valet, Pedro. He's also educated. He's literate, for one thing, because he spends hours reading this book. But he also makes references to a famous author and to a famous painter, and he recognizes that he is surrounded with valuable antiques. He seems to appreciate art. Maybe he has studied it. He's very cultured. Now let's jump to the second half of this story and talk about the characters in our story within a story. We have the young woman, first of all, and she's described as a maiden of rarest beauty and not more lovely than full of glee. So she's as happy as she was beautiful. She's playful. She's very loving. The text says her marriage to the painter is evil. So not unlucky, not sad, not a really bad idea. It's called evil. There's something predatory here. There's an element of doom at play in this marriage. The only thing in the world that she hates is art. Her husband's work specifically, because it monopolizes his time. It completely absorbs him and he has nothing left for her. She does not want to be painted. She goes along with it for his sake, but she seems to really want to stand apart from his work. She doesn't want to be fit into that world. She wants to have a real relationship. She wants to have a real bond with her husband. During the actual portrait process, she wastes away. She's almost like a prisoner in this tower, this little turret room. There's no good light in there. She doesn't get to do anything that she enjoys. She doesn't get to move around and get any kind of exercise. And it also doesn't seem like there's any friends coming to see just her, check on her and see how she is doing. Then we have the painter. He is obsessed with his work. There is no room in his life for anything else. He's a very talented guy, a famous guy. The text says he has high renown. He's well known. The text describes him as having already a bride in his art. He is absolutely devoted to his work, devoted to the artistic process. So this relationship was a bad idea for both of them because he is already married. He is not emotionally available to have a relationship. So this was a terrible idea for both him and the young woman. The text also says he took glory in his work. He took pride. He took satisfaction, self-worth. He found his purpose in his work, not in his family. Not in his relationships, not in his wife. He quite literally doesn't see her. He doesn't look at her, does not notice during these weeks in the tower that she is getting sicker and sicker. However, the text says that he would not see that she was getting sick. That makes it sound willful. This is a conscious choice on his part not to acknowledge her. He is going to choose his work first. He's not going to compromise his artistic process. Finally, there is art itself. Art is capitalized multiple times in the second half of the story, in that story within a story. It's capitalized like it's a proper name, like this is an active character that has a mind and a will of its own. Art is presented here as the painter's first wife, his first love. The young woman sees Art as her rival, but Art is an overpowering presence throughout this story. The young woman calls it her rival. It's a major focus of her animosity, a major focus in her life. The painter, it monopolizes his time and his energy and his focus. And even in the first half of the story, when we don't know the history of the painting, it has captivated the narrator. He can't take his eyes off of it. He really should be resting because apparently he has a major injury that he's trying to recover from, but instead he stays awake staring at this portrait. It's very monopolizing. So that's why I see Art as our vampire. This is our parasitic presence that's kind of sapping up the energy of the people around it. Let's talk about the painting itself, how it's described in the text. It has a gold frame. The narrator says it's Moresque, which means that it's very elaborate, has a very delicate lace-like design, and it's all done in gold. So this looks like a very expensive frame that's been chosen for this painting. It's done in the vignette style, which is a portrait style where the subject kind of melts out of the background. Instead of being painted in a particular place, like in a garden or in an office, they just kind of step out of the shadows. The narrator compares this portrait to the heads of Sully. He's making a reference to Thomas Sully, who was a very famous portrait artist, and the vignette style was one of the things that he did. The painting is displayed really poorly. For something that is apparently a masterpiece, just this incredible work of art, it does not have a place of pride. It is tucked into the corners, tucked into the shadows. So it's kind of wrapped in darkness and pushed away. This signifies shame. There is something that someone wants to forget about this painting. They don't want to dwell on it. They want to push it away, leave it behind, not think about it. Let's focus in closer on the actual portrait scene. So again, the players, we have the young woman who hates art. She consents to the portrait to please her husband, the painter. So the young woman is his wife, but Art, capital A Art, is presented as his first wife. Remember, he already had a bride in his Art. Up until now, these two forces in his life, these two wives, if you will, have been kept separate because the young woman doesn't like art. She's kept herself away from it. But when she consents to be painted, both of these characters end up in the same room, both vying for his attention. The portrait process pits these two characters, the young woman and Art, pits them against each other, puts them in a fight for their husband's attention, for the painter's attention. And he does not have enough bandwidth for the two of them. He can't look at them both at the same time. Literally, he can't look at them both at the same time. So he does not have enough attention, not enough devotion to sustain them both. So we could blame the young woman's death on her husband, He doesn't notice that she's getting sick. He just keeps pushing her through this process, even though it is clearly not good for her. So we could blame it on him, say that this death is a result of neglect. However, I think we can see it a different way. Remember, I said Art could be our vampire here. I think Art is a parasite in this story, and it's latched on to the painter, and it latches on to this young woman, and it affects not only them as individuals, but affects their relationship, pulls the life out of their marriage more and more as the story goes on and as the painting progresses. So we might argue that Art, if it's an active presence, an active character, actually kills the young woman, the young wife out of jealousy so that Art can possess the painter fully. So the young woman becomes weaker and weaker as the painting gets closer to completion. Let's look at the text. The tints, so that's the colors, The tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. So the color on the canvas is being taken from her cheeks. So it's like her life, her strength, her energy is all being directly transferred onto the canvas. This young woman who is described as all light and smiles, when she gets put in this dark tower, this turret, look how it describes the light. The light dripped upon the pale canvas. It's almost like she's bleeding out. Slowly her energy, her life force is being drained. Now, there is a moment at the end, right before he puts on the finishing touch, when the young woman seems to rally. She seems to get her spark back a little bit. And then he puts on the finishing touches, one at the eye and one at the mouth. I think it's interesting because those are the parts of the face that really show that the person is alive. Eye movement, and at the mouth, breathing. So that's the last thing he takes. He's taken her image, he's taken the color out of her complexion. At the very end, the painting takes her eye movement and her breath, and that is the moment when she dies. Let's also look at how the word pale is used in this scene. So the canvas begins as pale, and then the young woman becomes pale. Remember that line about the tints which he spread upon the canvas? The paint, the color of the paint was drawn from her cheeks. So she is losing color in her face as she becomes sicker and weaker. But it doesn't stop there. Eventually, the painter goes pale. In the last line, it says he became very pallid. Pallid means pale, like a sick person is pale, like something is wrong with you, pale. So perhaps he's the next victim here. Art, the painting has taken everything from her, taken everything, all the energy that it can from the young woman. So now the art has latched on to its next victim, latched on to the only other living thing in the room, the painter himself. And the portrait's influence also stretches beyond that scene. It stretches into the first part of the story. When the narrator first sees it, he's very disturbed by it. He says the lifelikeness it's too much. It's weird. He doesn't enjoy looking at it. Even though he can recognize this is an incredible work of art, it's basically a masterpiece, like the emotions he's feeling are not positive. Look at this. Startling, which means shocked, confounded, confused, subdued, that means you've been shut down, you've been silenced, and appalled, horrified. None of these are very positive reactions to the art. He's not really enjoying looking at it, but he can't take his eyes off of it. It's capturing his attention. It's taking his energy. It's keeping him awake, even though as an injured person, he probably really needs to sleep. He needs to lay down and relax. So this is more hints at a malevolent presence. This is a parasitic presence that latches on to the humans around it. Let's also look at the imagery of light and shadow in this story. So the painting has a spot on the wall that is in shadow. It can't be seen, and it doesn't come to light until the narrator adjusts this candle. He moves the candle forward and it causes the shadows to shift and bring this painting into the light. Then we have this vignette style for the portrait where the image, the subject seems to have just stepped out of the shadows. Their face is just getting hit by the light. Then we have the young woman herself, who's described as all light and smiles, until of course she gets taken to this dark, shadowy turret. Light also becomes almost a synonym for life itself. We talked about that line, light dripped upon the pale canvas from overhead. This image of the young woman bleeding out onto the canvas. The painting is gaining life as she is getting weaker. Remember that description of her as all light? She's all light and smiles. When she's deprived of light in this dark room, this turret, it withers her. It makes her wilt. It says it withered the health and spirits of the woman. When she is cut off from light, things start to go downhill from her. She cannot thrive without her life force, this light. There is a moment at the end where she rallies right before he puts on the finishing touches to the portrait. And it says her spirit flickered up as the flame on a lamp. That last spark of light before the lamp goes out. So that's her last spark of life before she's extinguished. Let's zoom in on the last line of the story. Let's read it again. While he yet gazed, the artist is looking at the painting, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast and crying with a loud voice, "This is life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. Okay, so life is capitalized in here, so it is important, the idea of life. So what does he mean when he says that? This is life itself, while he's staring at the painting. I think it could be a few things. I think he could be proud of himself. He could be saying, this is a masterpiece. I have finally done it. I have finally really managed to capture life in a painting. I think he could also be saying, my work is life. My art is life. This is my purpose. This is my bliss. He enjoys the process so very much. He might also be having a realization that love is life. His wife, his relationships, his family. This is real life. The people who come and view his work, his fans that see it while it's still in progress in the studio, that's what they're getting out of it. They're like, oh, wow, he's really talented. But this is definitely proof of his deep love for her that he's able to complete this painting. So perhaps the painter is coming to that realization as well, a little too late, because it says he became tremulous. So he was shaking, he was trembling, became very pallid. He lost color in his face. He became pale. Aghast means he's horrified, shocked. What have I done? And suddenly, it says, he suddenly turned to regard his beloved. So all of a sudden, perhaps he has realized what he's done. The reality of his situation has set in, and he suddenly turns to look at her. Of course, it's too late. All right, before we go, I want to take a quick look at some of Edgar Allan Poe's other work and how it relates to the oval portrait. So the big one is The Fall of the House of Usher. It has a lot of links to the oval portrait. It has a similar setting. We have this remote castle type house that's tucked away in the mountains. It's crammed full of sort of valuable but worn out antiques. And there is a vampire in that story, or rather a parasitic presence in that story. There's an inanimate object that seems to latch on and eat away at the human characters in the story. It also features a story within a story, which is what we see in the oval portrait. So right in the middle of The Fall of the House of Usher, there's a section titled The Haunted Palace, and it's a story within the larger story. Also, our leading man here, our painter, is very similar to the character Roderick Usher in that story. He's eccentric, he's very passionate, he's reclusive, and he's weirdly wound up in his work. Oval Portrait also has some links to other authors' work. Decades after it was published, Oscar Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, a very, very famous book. And if you've read it, or even if you haven't, it has to do with a very lifelike portrait that has an unnatural, weird, malevolent link to its human subject. Then there's a short story by Robert Louis Stevenson called Olaya that has a lot in common with Oval Portrait. We have a narrator who is an injured person who is convalescing in this remote castle setting that's tucked away somewhere, and while he is in this castle, he becomes entranced by a very lifelike portrait. Now, I have thought previously that Olaya was more closely linked to The Fall of the House of Usher. However, when I read the oval portrait, I was like, oh, there's the missing link. No disrespect to Robert Louis Stevenson. I think he was a very talented guy, but I'm also pretty sure he took The Fall of the House of Usher and the oval portrait and mixed them together and was like, ta-da, Olaya. So definitely go check that story out if these are the type of narratives that you like. All right, that's about all I've got on the oval portrait. I hope something in there was helpful to you. If it was, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next story or poem becomes available. Again, this story was by request, so thanks to the person who suggested it. If you had a different story in mind or a particular author that you're interested in, definitely drop that in the comments and I will see what I can do. Best of luck to you, and I'll see you in the next chapter.